175 years, the city of Akron, Ohio has continuously reinvented itself.
The thing that impresses me is the adaptability of the city.
Since its founding in 1825, Akron has been a city of invention.
Akron has a charm that many cities do not have.
In each of the past 2 centuries, Akron has been a city of industry.
Akron has been a hotbed of entrepreneurs, and very lucky ones.
As the people of Akron prepared to enter the 21st century, the celebration of the new millennium was also a celebration that Akron, today, remains a city inspired.
To understand history, you always have to employ your imagination.
On December 6, 1825, General Simon Perkins of Warren carried an entire summer's work through the wild country of the Western Reserve. At Ravenna, seat of Portage County, he would record the plat for a new town to be built on the canal that would bisect the Ohio frontier. His town would be called Akron, from the Greek word meaning high place.
Akron is located where it is because of a geographic truth. We are right smack on the watershed line dividing the northward flowing rivers of the Great Lakes Basin from the southward flowing streams of the Muskingum, Ohio, Mississippi.
A large body of water was located just south of the new town. Summit Lake straddled the watershed divide. Ultimately, canal engineers would lower the level of the lake by 9 feet.
The original plat of Akron shows a line right up to the southern extremity of the proposed city. And if you look at the fine print, which is almost illegible, it says this represents the high point or the shore of the lake, meaning Summit Lake, which in periods of high water inundated the land all the way up to what's now Exchange Street.
Akron is carved out of Berea sandstone, left behind by the sea that covered Ohio 300 million years ago. Akron's hills and ravines were sculpted by glaciers of ice hundreds of feet thick. They define the city's landscape even today.
When they were retreating, around 17,000 years ago, an immense lake of meltwater formed in the Cuyahoga Valley and in the valley of the Little Cuyahoga. And when the lake filled with meltwater, it finally found a little outlet and flowed south into a river. What was left was simply this great swale of a lost river valley that lay between North Street and Summit Lake.
Over generations of time, we have so manicured and modified the terrain that today the hills are much less steep and abrupt, and the ravines and valleys are much less deep.
Dense forests of oak and hickory, beech and maple greeted the people who first arrived in the valley of the Cuyahoga River 10,000 years ago.
People moved about between the Tuscarawas and the Cuyahoga rivers. We think from the archaeological evidence that they went north in the summertime and probably went back to the southern part of Ohio or along the Ohio River to harvest those resources in the wintertime. Because the Cuyahoga Valley, for example, would have been pretty good living in the summertime. Lots of game, lots of wildfowl, plenty of fish, nuts and fruits and berries of that sort. So it was a very rich environmental setting. We know that they conducted some ceremonies, but we don't have a tribal name per se for them.
Between the rivers was the watershed divide. The original inhabitants portaged the distance on a path carved from the wilderness by bison, elk, and deer.
When I first came here to Akron in 1941,
I became interested in its history, its Indian history, its trails, and so on. And I found the Portage Path here was perhaps the most intriguing of them all.
Joe Jasinski came to Akron to manage Sand Run and other metropolitan parks. He has hiked the trails, the tow paths, and the riverbanks, and absorbed the history they contain.
Now, the Indians made all kinds of trails. War trails, berry picking trails, and hunting trails, and you name it. And of course here was where a number of them met. The Portage Path itself met down at the bottom there, started there, coming from the east.
The Indian Trail appeared on the earliest maps of the United States, including charts used by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. The Portage Path climbed the valley and follows present-day Portage Path, past the great home of the Seiberling family, Stan Hewitt. The path is marked at Highland Square.
There you begin to see definite evidences of the path by the statue that was erected there back in the early 20s.
The people who first walked the path are remembered in another sculpture by Akron artist Don Drum. The route crosses Exchange Street, where a marker was set into the wall that surrounds the Perkins estate long ago. The portage continues along Diagonal Road, then cuts sharply through Perkins Woods and the Akron Zoo. At Worcester Avenue, the Indian Trail follows East Avenue and turns onto Manchester Road along the edge of Summit Lake.
On the upper part of a high hill there called Cherbondi Hill was a favorite lookout point for the Indians, because from up there they could see for miles.
As the Indian Trail approaches its southern terminus, it intersects the Old Canal and ends at the northern edge of the Tuscarawas River.
Now, Nesbitt Lake is a natural lake, and therefore it was in existence at a time when the Indians were here. They claimed that Captain Pipe, who was the chief Indian in that territory, he had his village there, and numerous other campsites were all around the rim of that lake.
Today, the trail of the Portage Path represents one of the oldest continuous visible marks on the landscape of North America.
This area in the mid-18th century attracted quite a number of Indians, mostly Senecas from western New York State, accompanied a little later by some Ottawas and Wyandottes from the Detroit area. In the 1740s, the early 1740s, there might have been as many as 2,400 Indians living in the Cuyahoga. Then, due to European wars, which changed the relationship between France and Great Britain, the trading posts disappeared, and so did the Indians.
So we often find flakes, we find points or arrowheads, and we find blades, which are the larger arrowheads. Very often the pottery was made to be used for a brief period of time, maybe a couple of seasons. There's some thought that they didn't even carry much of it around with them. They made it out of local clay.
As European immigrants moved into the Ohio country, they encountered tribal groups of Native Americans. From 1785 until 1805, the Portage Path helped mark the treaty line of western expansion.
They forced pretty much a treaty upon these representatives of the Indian tribes. It was called the Treaty of Fort McIntosh, 1785. And they got the Indians to sign the treaty by getting them drunk and filling them with more food than they had seen in a long time.
So you see, on one side of the path, maybe if you were going south, on the right-hand side of the path here, that was over Indian territory. Over here was the settlers. They didn't dare come over in here until later on when they bought this from the Indians.
New settlers in Hudson and Talmadge feared for their lives and sought protection from the Ohio militia. General Elijah Wadsworth set up camp near Sand Run, not far from the highway the troops would follow to Detroit, Smith Road. During the War of 1812, near the Big Bend in the river, was the dry dock where, according to information recently developed, the U.S. Army and early settlers built ships that would follow Commodore Perry after the Battle of Lake Erie.
The river itself was the launching place for these hulls, and just a little to the right of it was where several pits had been dug and where these hulls had been manufactured and assembled. They had provisions for a mast, for using out on the open water, and oarlocks and all that for rowing in the river. They were used to transport troops and certain amount of supplies.
After 1812, settlers rushed into the Ohio country. Some found a home in Middlebury, a village founded in 1807 by retired sea captain Joseph Hart. Here the rapids of the Little Cuyahoga River were dammed. The rushing water powered a flour mill, a sawmill, a woolen mill, and a distillery. West of Middlebury was another early settler, a major in the militia, Minor Spicer.
In 1810, Spicer came out here to explore some land that he had got in payment for some services, and decided it looked attractive, and brought his family out in an ox cart, and his cousin Paul Williams came out with him, and his cousin's wife. And his lots were up around Akron Ute. What we now know as Spicertown, of course, comes from that. Paul Williams was over the brow of the hill in the St. Bernard's area.
Paul Williams was a farmer. He provided food and shelter to General Perkins surveyor Joshua Henshaw, who laid out the new city in the summer of 1825. Perkins is remembered as Akron's founder, but it was Williams who also donated lots to the state of Ohio for a new canal.
When the time came in 1825, and the decision had been pretty much made behind the scenes by Alfred Kelly, the commissioner for the Northern District, Kelly approached Perkins, said there were so many locks that it was going to be essential that a town be put here.
The importance of the Ohio and Erie Canal is fundamental to Akron's history. It's the reason for our being, because it was at this point that the canal engineers found it possible to cross the watershed divide between the Ohio River and the Great Lakes watersheds.
A beautiful little town was laid out. Wide streets, big public square, which we know as Perkins Square, with half a square across the street for public buildings. And it was a model town in every sense of the word, done right by his man, Joshua Henshaw.
Building Ohio's canals between 1825 and 1832, at least the one in our part of the state, was just an amazing feat. The people who built the canals in Ohio were workers who had dug the Erie Canal in New York and had learned the trade of digging with a spade, a scoop to take the dirt out, and a wooden wheelbarrow. They received 25 cents a day here in Ohio, plus a jigger of whiskey a day. Altogether, there were some 813 miles of canals in Ohio. They were the interstates of the day.
Land that was once thought to be essentially worthless was selling for 1,000 times its previous value. The costs of bringing manufactured products from the east into Ohio was reduced by about 90%. The people in the Akron area lived in the best of all possible worlds. They were now able to sell dear and buy cheap.
Immediately, farmers began bringing their wheat, particularly, to grist mills, which used the water power at each of the locks. And these mills could load the resulting flour directly into canal boats.
Middlebury had wanted the canal traffic, but lost it to General Perkins. Now that the canal was open, Dr. Eliakim Crosby, a Middlebury physician, boldly suggested an imaginative plan to harness both the runoff from the canal and the power of the Little Cuyahoga.
Together, those waters gave a tremendous early start to industry here. It is what made Akron. It was not merely a settlement, it was a bustling industrial town with woolen mills and all kinds of milling activities there that were powered by the falling water from the mill race that was brought in from the Little Cuyahoga.
The race paralleled the river until it turned south and barreled through a ditch that is the main street of today. the water turned the giant wheels erected at the place still called Mill Street. Now Akron was booming. Population grew. Jobs were plentiful. A new tavern went up at Main and Exchange. Akron began to look like a city. Between 1832 and 1862, water power became steam power. Canal boat shipments became railroad freight. Then, as the need arose to feed the Union Army during the Civil War, a German immigrant, Ferdinand Schumacher, invented a new product, oatmeal, that would make Akron the center of the cereal industry worldwide.
This represents the history of the city of Akron as from a manufacturing standpoint.
At Main Place in downtown Akron, artist Michael Gearhart has marked the passages of time in Akron's industrial history.
And through this mural, I tried to bring to people's attention different things that were made here that they may not be aware of.
Now, Akron retained its position as one of the largest milling centers in the country until well into the late years of the 19th century. Quaker Oats maintained a substantial presence in Akron until 1972. And of course, to this day, Akron still has some of the remnants of that era physically in the famous Quaker Hilton Hotel in the old silos up on Broadway, and the company offices and part of the barley mill of Schumacher, which is part of the modern commercial complex.
The booming cereal industry of the Civil War era inspired a group of industrious men to launch a new manufacturing enterprise, mechanical mowers and reapers. The names of that industry are names known today: Buchtel, Hauer, Seiberling, Krauss, and McNeil. The industry flourished under the genius of Lewis Miller, inventor, industrialist, educator, philanthropist, and founder of Chautauqua, the institution and the movement that has inspired millions. In his home in 1888, America's greatest inventor would wed Lewis Miller's daughter, Mina. The Summit County Historical Society maintains the home of Akron's founding family. The son of Akron's founder, also named Simon Perkins, built the mansion atop the hill overlooking Akron from the west. On thousands of acres purchased by General Perkins, fine merino sheep would be raised, and there between 1844 and 1846 lived his partner, an expert in wool grading, John Brown.
Well, Akron had a fairly long tradition of opposition to the peculiar institution, as African Negro slavery was labeled by its opponents. And it was largely through the New Englanders of the region that there was this hardcore group of resistors to the slave institution.
African American families have been a fabric of the Akron community since the early 1800s. Many of the African American families in the early 1800s were employed as masons, skilled laborers, barbers, some were sailors. So they had come to Akron as freed slaves and were looking for employment and a better life.
The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 permitted bounty hunters to go north and retrieve their property. In the spring of 1854, a popular barber named Jim Worthington was arrested and taken to Akron's train depot for the ride south. A furious posse of respectable Akron men and women crowded the train platform. The slave catchers retreated. Worthington remained. John Brown had long left Akron when he returned to get rifles, knives, and swords, donated by old friends, some taken from storage at the county jail.
Lucius Bierce, who had been longtime mayor of Akron, got up in a public speech and he said, it's been said old Brown was crazy. He said, would to God there were millions of such crazy men in the North.
Brown and his sons murdered a man, his wife, and children in a skirmish called Bloody Kansas. And for his treason at Harper's Ferry in 1859, John Brown was hanged.
On the day of his hanging back here in Akron, the court was dismissed, stores closed, some buildings were draped in black crepe, and again Lucius Bierce got up and eulogized our old friend and neighbor John Brown. So he did have an enormous impact upon bringing to a white-hot heat the disagreement between the North and the South on the slavery issue.
On May 28, 1851, a tall, dark woman named Isabella von Swearingen stood at the second annual convention of the Women of Ohio. She asserted the civil and human rights of women and of the African slaves in one of history's most famous speeches.
Sojourner Truth, she was far more than just the woman who gave the speech. A 6-foot-tall woman. She was not an attractive woman, but her moral fiber, the moral fiber behind this woman, says more about her than the speech, Ain't I a Woman.
On a summer's day in the year 1900, the people of Akron began to hear bits and pieces of a story about a black man named Lewis Peck, who had been charged with the rape of a white girl on Perkins Hill. Akron's newspapers carried the story the next day on the front page in red ink. A mob gathered at City Hall that night. They demanded that the sheriff release the accused to them. Deputies had already sensed trouble and had taken Peck out of town. On the night of August 21st, 1900, the mob burned Akron City Hall to the ground and pushed the city's new electric police wagon into the canal. 13 years later, Lewis Peck was pardoned by the governor of Ohio. It is a souvenir of the age of glaciers. Resting below the sand rock and the shale, beds of potter's clay 6 to 8 feet thick. First discovered near modern-day Ellet in 1828, Edwin Merrill started a pottery business in Middlebury in 1847. Others followed. They made bottles and smoking pipes, earthenware, and Rockingham stoneware. By 1870, Akron inventors had developed a process known as vitrification. It created a clay impervious to water. Akron became the sewer pipe manufacturing capital of the world.
People kind of smile and smirk at that, but when you think that the great cities of America were rapidly developing and that their old primitive water and sewage systems were inadequate and had to be replaced, a good, reliable sewer pipe, inexpensive, was essential to their development. And Akron made simply the best sewer pipe available.
New York City's subway system used vitrified tile from Akron, as did every other major city being built at the end of the 19th century.
I think it's related to the fact of our being a clay industry area that we have all the brick streets in Akron. Many of them are covered up with asphalt now, but even there, some of the streets have been restored because of people finding them charming. I just love them where I see them because they kind of follow the contours of the land underneath as time goes by, and they fit that land sort of like an old glove fits a hand.
Once viewed as inexhaustible, the ancient supply of potter's clay sustained the ceramics industry in Akron only until 1915.
The American toy industry had its origins right here in Akron.
For children of the 19th century, toys were handmade. Children of wealthy families could afford toys made of tin and dolls made of porcelain. But for the large numbers of children whose parents toiled in factories, there were no mass-produced toys until an Akron man was inspired to do just that.
Behind me is the site of the American Marble and Toy Manufacturing. This goes back to about 1892, and the factory burnt down in 1904. This was the very first time the toys were ever mass-produced, to the point where for a penny, a child could afford to buy a whole handful of marbles.
Michael Cohill, an Akron toy maker, discovered a world that most residents of Akron know little about. It was Akron newspaperman Sam Dyke who started a toy company in 1884 to make premiums for cereal companies and novelties for political campaigns.
Samuel Dyke invented a machine that would mass-produce toys. In order to manufacture spheres, clay marbles, there's a great deal of science and physics involved, and there were all these experiments that were done to try and do this with clay.
The science of manufacturing spheres led another Akron inventor, Martin Christensen, to develop a machine to make steel ball bearings. He then employed glassmaker James Layton to use the invention to make perfect spheres from glass.
In polite society, they kind of frowned upon what Sam Dyke was doing. They thought he was stealing money from the pockets of children. But once Sam Dyke started selling millions of these a day, they opened up their own competing marble factories. These toys were for the common children. Anybody with a penny could afford to buy a handful of marbles.
Between 1895 and 1955, factories around Akron produced more units of playthings than any place on Earth. Walt Disney characters flowed from the molds at Sun Rubber and Cyberling Latex. 40 different farm characters were the inspiration of Russian immigrant Dietrich Rempel, whose invention of rotational molding is still used by toy makers today. Millions of coloring books, storybooks, paper dolls, puzzles, and games were manufactured by Sawfield Publishing. For most of the 20th century, American children played with toys made in Akron.
There was already a diversified industrial base in Akron when Dr. B.F. Goodrich first made his appearance in 1870. He found here the elements needed for his own industrial needs, which included a ready supply of water available in the Ohio and Erie Canal, a labor force that had some experience working with machinery. He was able to get coal, nice quality coal, directly from the mines in northern Coventry Township. He had a community of entrepreneurial types already established in Akron. And these men, some 13 in number, contributed about $1,000 or $500 apiece to provide additional capital, which added on to what he already had acquired.
Akron had the water, the land, and the labor required to support the fledgling rubber industry at the turn of the century. Its principal product, fire hose, gave way to a new craze, bicycles. Akron needed a boost. The Depression of 1893 had forced cereal companies to combine and eventually move to Chicago. International Harvester pooled the assets of the farm machinery industry and moved its operation west as well. In 1898, the son of industrialist John Cyberling used the proceeds from the sale of his family's failed farm machinery business to duplicate Dr. Goodrich's success. Frank Cyberling wanted a name for his business, the greatest name in rubber, and he called his startup company Goodyear, after the long-deceased inventor who first vulcanized rubber. In 1900, a young man from Columbiana, Ohio, came to Akron after selling rubber buggy tires in Detroit. Harvey Firestone was poised to take advantage of a brand-new industry that would revolutionize Akron, America, and the 20th century, the automobile.
On the surface, there was a good deal of cordiality. Below the surface, there was always this very intense rivalry. It was poor form for people from Goodrich or Goodyear or Firestone to interact too casually with one another. There was always a little suspicion that trade or sales secrets were going to be divulged.
Akron's population more than doubled between 1910 and 1920. In copycat fashion, dozens of privately owned rubber shops opened up all around Akron. They borrowed each other's manufacturing techniques, and they all needed labor.
Akron grew at an immense rate, and while there was no organized planning in that day, no planning commission even, somebody had a lot of foresight, and very large tracts were annexed and joined into the city, partly for industrial reasons, partly for residential.
The barons of the rubber industry built their great homes away from the smog and the soot. Harvey Firestone built Harbell Manor, Polo Grounds included, on the site of today's Georgetown complex. General Tire founder C. William O'Neill built his mansion on West Exchange Street. And F.A. Seiberling built Stan Hewitt. Tens of thousands of men shared housing, and on occasion used sleeping rooms in shifts.
There was just enormous growth in the tire business, desperate need for people, so the recruiters were turned loose in Appalachia, where there were literally hundreds of thousands of underemployed people on worn-out farms, exhausted forests and mines and so forth. And they came literally by the hundreds of thousands into certain northern industrial cities.
Unlike the steel cities of Youngstown and Cleveland, where European migrants were Catholic, Orthodox, or Jew, the Akron population recruited from states south of the Mason-Dixon line was overwhelmingly Protestant.
Akron had over 100,000 fairly new citizens who came out of a culture that was suspicious of foreign elements. Most of the known bootleggers who were being rounded up in this Prohibition era had European foreign names to these folks from down at Possum Run and Peach Blossom. And so out of fear that the American way of life, which was in their minds their own way of life, out of fear that it was being destroyed by these foreigners, they lashed out with, in some cases, just intimidation, mostly through hooded parades.
In 1920s Akron, the Ku Klux Klan became the single most potent political force in the community. A judge, a sheriff, and a majority of the school board were Klansmen. Pastor Lloyd Douglas of the First Congregational Church spoke out against the Klan, as did a young Akron lawyer who led citizens groups against Klan activities. His name was Wendell Wilkie. The Klan was gone, but what remained was a yearning among Akron's Appalachian immigrants for a Bible-based tradition of religion.
I think there was not another city in the United States of the size of Akron that gave birth to so many really major, not just national but international, fundamentalist Protestant independent congregations.
Carl Burnham began preaching on the radio. He founded the church that today is The Chapel, one of the nation's largest independent congregations. Kentucky tire builder Dallas Billington possessed the preaching style to build the largest Sunday school in the world at the Akron Baptist Temple. Arkansas tent revivalist Rex Humbard planted his musical ministry at Calvary Temple, later becoming the most widely viewed television personality in the world. Faith healer Ernest Angley has hosted his global ministry from Grace Cathedral in Akron. A common thread among these ministries arose from one preacher, the Reverend Bill Denton. Another Akron industry was born during World War I, when Goodyear made balloons for the U.S. Navy. After the war, the military commissioned an airship to be made in Germany. Goodyear President Paul Litchfield wanted to build transoceanic airships in Akron. He persuaded Dr. Karl Arnstein to move to Akron with a dozen German engineers. They designed the largest building in the world without interior supports. They constructed 2 airships for the Navy, the USS Akron and Macon, each meeting a tragic end. Today, the popular blimp Spirit of Goodyear remains Akron's lighter-than-air legacy.
Goodyear and Firestone, especially Goodyear, were among the country's leaders in what was called industrial paternalism. They provided, through company facilities and financial support, just about anything that a family of company workers would want to do. Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, bridge clubs, bow and arrow clubs, yacht clubs, golf courses.
Goodyear paternalism had worked very effectively for a long period of time through the 19-teens and 1920s, and even to some extent in the 1930s. But with the Depression, there wasn't as much money, and people were laid off, even though wages were still pretty high and the benefits were very good. There was a lot of disillusionment.
Akron, the city of opportunity, was now the city of poverty and frustration. Particularly hard hit by the Great Depression, industrial unemployment reached 60% in 1933. Akron became a national center for worker discontentment as the question was asked, who would call the shots?
The tire industry depended on workers who were big and strong and tough and saw themselves as independent, self-reliant, and a lot better than most other people. And those people, especially the tire makers, the men who assembled the tires, were the leaders of the labor movement.
Labor strikes were not new, but it was Akron Union President Rex Murray who invented a new way to paralyze an entire company. At 7 p.m. on June 19, 1934, the workers at General Tire turned off their machines and refused to work. Sit-down strike became a household phrase.
The workers here were very well aware that this was a technique that could work under some conditions. And so in 1935, when they really were very unhappy about the way things were going, they resort to the sit-down strike, and that finally results in the great Goodyear strike of 1936. And lo and behold, by the end of 1936, people in the auto industry, in the textile industry, and other industries began to pick up on these techniques, began to, at least indirectly, emulate the Akron workers.
The day had ended when company presidents knew their workers by name. Industrial paternalism was gone. Today, Akron continues to benefit from that legacy.
Goodyear Heights is one of the most remarkable places in urban history. Instead of just allowing people to build up junk housing, though a lot of that came up in Akron, F.A. Seiberling developed Goodyear Heights with architect-designed houses and a layout that was prepared by Warren Manning, a landscape architect who had been trained by Frederick Law Olmsted of Central Park fame. Firestone Park was developed along the same lines. And again, the landscape architect who had been Firestone's landscape architect for Harbell Manor refused to lay out the Firestone Park area.
Akron had its share of shabby, run-down housing, especially in the valley between downtown and North Hill. A young banker, Paul Belcher, chaired Akron's new Metropolitan Housing Authority. There was pressure for new construction from building suppliers who had materials to sell and craftsmen who were anxious for work. Local officials and real estate dealers viewed subsidized housing as socialistic. But Elizabeth Park became the first of nearly 1,000 homes that would be opened over the next 4 years. The Great Depression also created opportunity for industrious entrepreneurs who lost their jobs at the rubber shops. Eager to undercut railroad prices, motor freight haulers launched what would become Akron's second largest industry for more than 40 years. English teacher Carol Rausch, with his brother Galen, turned 2 trucks and a pocketful of capital into Roadway Express. In just 20 years, the Rausch brothers had 3,000 trucks in 22 states and $30 million in sales. Today, the fortune created by the Rausch family is seen everywhere that the GAR Foundation invests in the community. Akron entered the age of air transportation in 1928. A hangar was built in East Akron where Shorty Fulton had been landing primitive aircraft. Soon a terminal building befitting Akron's role as a major industrial city was erected. Federal programs to put men to work saw 1,000 men build new runways at Akron's airport. A hole remained in the nearby hillside after providing the fill dirt for the airport. A huge force of WPA workers carved Akron's rubber bowl into the site. On Mother's Day of 1935, at the Gate Lodge of Stan Hewitt, the daughter-in-law of Goodyear's founder performed a simple but potent introduction. Henrietta Seiberling invited New Yorker Bill Wilson to her tiny home to have coffee with her friend Dr. Bob Smith of Akron City Hospital. That night, the basic principles of Alcoholics Anonymous were formed, and from it grew the largest self-help organization the world has ever seen. Women provided vigorous leadership. At every event in Akron's history, women were there, often unseen and unheralded.
From the very first days in the rubber industry, women were there, and not just in the offices. They were running the machines, they were making the boots, they were making the shoes, they were making the bicycle tires, and they were making the toys.
Women filled jobs on the assembly line to a degree they had not before.
Women made not only the tires, both the smaller tires and the larger tires, including airplane tires. They also made the decoys, they made the life vests, they made the pontoon boats, they made the blimps.
World War II was the economic salvation of Akron, no question about it. And Akron was an unbelievable powerhouse. Although it was only the 5th largest city in Ohio, it had the 3rd largest industrial employment and in war industry.
While the factories turned out wartime materiel, Akron laboratories were engaged in the struggle to find the secret known only to Adolf Hitler's scientists. The secret of synthetic rubber.
Rubber chemistry was taught to serve the rubber industry in the first class taught here in 1910 by Charles Knight. It then developed through the 20s and into the 1940s when the Second World War occurred.
Firestone had managed to smuggle chemicals out of Germany to analyze in the laboratory in Akron. Goodrich's Waldo Seaman made development of the natural rubber substitute a round-the-clock effort. Some historians believe that Akron's exertion to produce synthetic rubber in large quantities had as much to do with the Allied victory as the Manhattan A-bomb project itself.
That was, I think, the beginning of modern polymer science, because we began to understand what these long molecules were and how they're made into materials of use in commerce. The plastics industry literally exploded after the Second World War.
Post-war Akron tried to get back to normal.
Akron had some unusual advantages after World War II, thanks to those immense annexations that had been made during the boom period that went way beyond where the population was going. We had plenty of buildable land. So a lot of new houses were built here, many of them Cape Cods and ranch-type houses that we're seeing today. And we had that opportunity to renew the housing stock here at the time when many of the other old industrial cities had been choked in by suburbs around them and couldn't develop.
Akron of the 1950s had a bustling downtown and new housing in Ellet, in Kenmore, and in West Akron. Goodyear, Goodrich, Firestone, and General Tire dominated Akron's business and social life. But the city had a long memory. The Depression devastated the city, and few were willing to take the risks that would push Akron forward. except one man who arrived on the campus of the University of Akron in 1951.
A new president was hired, Norman P. Auburn, and he came into Akron with a very clear vision of what it would take to make the university into a real, legitimate, bona fide university with graduate programs, with research activities, with broadened undergraduate curricular offerings, and so forth. And I believe, more than any single individual, he helped overcome what I call a depression psychology that had settled in on the city.
Others led Akron into a new era of concerns about the quality of life. Edwin J. Thomas, chairman of Goodyear, Beacon Journal publisher John S. Knight, Urban League president Vernon Odom, and Edwin Shaw, whose estate began the Akron Community Foundation. Akron was in another boom era in the 1960s, with plentiful orders for bias-ply tires and rubber products. Wages for URW members were among the best in the nation, but all the signs of change were present.
The rubber business was never a favorite of the stock market, for obvious reasons. It was too competitive. It operated on too narrow a profit margin. It was bitterly dog eat dog, and which held everybody's profits down. It was not an attractive product to most people. The old saying in Akron was, when Detroit sneezes, Akron catches cold, and that was very true. Akron was in the dirty end of the automotive business. All of the glamour, the wonderful advertisements with gorgeous women and so forth, those were all the finished model assembled cars. Detroit got all of the glory. Akron built those dirty black tires down there.
The 1976 strike came at an incredibly important moment when decisions were being made about the future of the rubber industry. There was a dramatic change in technology at the time. The energy crisis of the early 1970s had put a lot of pressure on profits and had raised demands for more efficiency, new technology, new ways of doing things.
Labor got greedy and asked for excessive benefits, very, very costly benefits, and wage increases. And the automotive makers in the 1950s and 60s were complacent and arrogant. They had the markets of the world to themselves.
The American tire manufacturers, the 5 large ones, 4 headquartered here in Akron, and some smaller ones, very much dominated the North American market. One company, Michelin, in France, took a very bold move in 1948. When radials came along, they brought with them this inevitable requirement that for every unit of production, there had to be a new element of capital investment in order to modify the equipment, or perhaps in some cases even to replace with new equipment the existing equipment. And I think without exception, as each of the companies looked at that additional investment requirement, this tended to work against the Akron facilities because they were the oldest and the least cost-competitive facilities. There was a feeling that this was going to disturb the fundamental economics of the tire business around the world, and it was going to, and it did.
Downtown stores became vacant. Polsky's and O'Neill's shuttered their popular department store windows on Main Street. Suburban development flourished. Akron was looking for a renaissance. Until the city could reinvent itself once again, a group of young musicians was inspired to lead a revolution in music.
In the late 70s, Akron was extremely important in rock and roll. There were ideas flying around, and there were bands that wanted to play music, but they had no place to go, and so they just kind of took it upon themselves to make something happen. They invented a scene for themselves, this being a city of a great inventive tradition. I think you had the just good fortune of having some like-minded people working together at the same time. So you had bands like Devo and Tin Huey and the bizarros, and later the waitresses, all of whom had kind of an artistic sensibility, but you had them working together, all sounding different, but all being of a piece. And so suddenly, nationally, people would refer to the Akron sound, and it would refer to this sort of quirky, energetic, new kind of rock. Ohio. Chrissie Hynde didn't make her name here, but she certainly was from here and has always been proud of that and has never sort of put that fact aside. And so there's always been this association of Akron with rock and roll. Devo couldn't be from any place except Akron.
People had this attitude that the city was just going to fold because so many things had happened in such a short period of time. There's a resiliency here, and I think there's an understanding maybe over the years that we've changed so many times that we're maybe more creative and accepting of innovation and change.
The thing that impresses me is the adaptability of the city. It's had distinct stages and cycles. They have come to an end and something new has started.
We're fortunate to have an industry that was, as it left us seeds off a dying tree, as I describe it, in a way that the polymer industry grew out of the technology and the research and development that took place here as a part of the rubber industry being here.
Is there any other city in America the size of Akron which has a larger number of accomplishments in industry, in social history, in entertainment and sports?
Akron has always been described as an overgrown small town. It has had an unusual kind of inner cohesion in its development.
Akron is a perfect size community because it's big enough to have some feel of a large city, but it's small enough to kind of have a sense of oneself, that we know each other and have a feeling of community about it. And I think it's almost perfect sized in that respect.
Sometimes I don't know why it is, but I have many, many friends who have reached retirement age, as I have, who came here to be with the rubber companies, and the time has come for them to go home, and they find that Akron is home.
Akron remains a city inventive, a city industrious, a city inspired.